Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. My name is Daniel Browning. I'm 26 years old, originally from a small town in Colorado, and I work at a local outdoor supply store. I spent the last year saving every spare dollar so I could fulfill a dream, visiting Tokyo during the famous cherry blossom season. I researched every little detail: transportation cards, language basics, how to navigate the major train lines, and which parks would have the most impressive blossoms. I even memorized a few key phrases in Japanese, hoping to immerse myself in the culture. I expected a joyful experience filled with colorful blooms, street food, bustling sidewalks, and cheerful gatherings under flowering trees. What I encountered instead was something no guidebook could prepare me for. I landed at Haneda Airport on a mild afternoon in late March. My flight was a bit delayed due to a sudden change in weather over the Pacific, but I was still excited. I recall standing in the arrival area, noticing how organized and efficient everything seemed. People were moving in neat lines, waiting for luggage or heading to customs. My friend Sarah, who had arrived 2 days earlier, had planned to meet me at my hotel later in the day. She had already messaged me pictures of beautiful pink canopies in Ueno Park, describing the lively atmosphere. I stared at those photos on my phone while waiting to pick up my suitcase. At the time, nothing seemed particularly ominous. A few overhead announcements mentioned some unusual health advisory and reminded travelers to practice basic hygiene. I remember hearing something about an infection in a neighboring prefecture, but the details were unclear. It felt like background noise, akin to how airports often have many different reminders and ongoing announcements. I glanced at a digital notice board as I exited customs. It displayed a brief message in both Japanese and English. Please be aware of government health guidelines. Seek assistance if experiencing unusual symptoms. I shrugged it off as a routine health reminder. Countries often ramp up precautions during flu season. It never occurred to me that this notice might foreshadow something far more serious. The staff at the airport wore face masks, but that was normal in Japan for those who had colds or wanted to avoid spreading germs. So I collected my luggage and headed to the monorail that would take me into central Tokyo. The plan was to drop my things off at a modest hotel in the Taito ward, close to Ueno Station, then meet Sarah at the park. When I reached the monorail platform, I noticed something unusual. People looked uneasy in a way I couldn't quite describe. A few travelers held phones close to their faces, scanning through news updates. I overheard some whispered conversations in Japanese, though my limited language skills prevented me from picking up more than a few words like virus and danger. Most of it was still unclear to me. I told myself it was probably just local news about a flu outbreak. Even so, I sensed an odd tension, as if everyone was waiting for something else to happen. During the ride into the city, the monorail was less crowded than I had expected. I had read that this route is usually packed with business travelers and tourists, especially on a weekday afternoon. Instead, the seats were only half full. An older gentleman in a suit across the aisle kept looking at his phone and glancing nervously around the train car. Every time the train's automated voice announced the next station, he seemed more concerned. Finally, he spoke with a younger man sitting next to him. I couldn't understand everything they said, but I caught the words infection, spreading, and a phrase that sounded like stay indoors. I tried to check my phone for any major headlines. I saw a couple of local alerts, but they were in Japanese, and I only grasped snippets like rapid spread of unknown infection and avoid crowded areas. My phone didn't show me any urgent warnings in English, so I assumed maybe it was a localized issue. I told myself I would ask at my hotel and figure out if I needed to take extra precautions. I just wanted to see the cherry blossoms I had dreamed about for so long. When we arrived at Hamamatsucho Station to transfer onto the JR Yamanote line, I discovered something that struck me as very unusual. The station was quiet. Not entirely empty, but certainly not as bustling as I'd seen in videos or as described by friends. Tokyo stations typically hum with constant noise. People rush across platforms, announcements blare, and trains come and go every few minutes. This station had a hushed air. A station guard was standing by a gate, speaking to a group of worried tourists in broken English. I overheard him say something about certain trains not running their full routes. He advised them to stay near their hotels until the local government shared more information. I continued to my next train, feeling uncertain but still determined to settle into my hotel. My connecting train was on time, but the car itself felt eerie. A few other passengers huddled in pairs or small groups. Their eyes darted around as if expecting a problem at any moment. I tried to message Sarah but got no immediate response. That was strange because Sarah is the type of person who responds quickly, especially when we're in a new place. I decided to wait and focus on navigating to my hotel. It was only a few stops away, and I'd soon be able to gather some real answers. I arrived at Ueno Station about an hour later and walked out onto the streets. Ordinarily, during cherry blossom season, this part of Tokyo would be full of life. Tourists would be dragging suitcases behind them, locals would be carrying groceries or heading home, and the sidewalks would be a blur of movement. That day, the streets were noticeably quieter. Some shops had their shutters half closed. Others had signs taped to the doors referencing an emergency closure. People seemed to avoid lingering outside. Before heading to my hotel, I decided to take a short stroll toward Ueno Park to see the blossoms. My suitcase wasn't too heavy, and the park was only a few blocks away. As I approached the park entrance, I noticed far fewer hanami, flower viewing gatherings than I expected. A few families were there, but something felt off. Some individuals wore thicker masks, not the usual disposable kind but heavy-duty versions, covering most of their faces. Others stood in nervous clusters, scanning around as though looking for an escape route. I moved forward, determined to glimpse those legendary pink canopies. Fallen petals dotted the ground, forming a pastel carpet. The trees themselves looked radiant, the blossoms in full bloom. Under different circumstances, this would have been the highlight of my trip. The air felt cool, with a mild breeze that gently carried the scent of fresh blooms. Then I noticed items strewn across the grass, abandoned picnic mats, half-eaten bento boxes, and water bottles left behind. The distinct hum of large gatherings was absent. I tried calling Sarah again. This time, the call didn't even connect. My phone showed only intermittent service. I wondered if the local phone towers were overwhelmed. I felt a bit of concern, but I decided not to panic. Tokyo is usually well organized, and I figured there must be a logical explanation for all these unusual events. Maybe there was a big government alert, and people had been told to stay home. I found my way back to the main street and continued to my hotel. It was a small, business-style hotel, the kind often used by budget travelers. The bright neon sign that I had seen online was turned off. When I walked into the lobby, I saw only one person at the front desk, tapping anxiously on a keyboard. A middle-aged woman, wearing a neatly pressed uniform, looked up at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected any more guests. She greeted me politely. "Welcome," she said in halting English. "You have a reservation?" "Yes," I replied, telling her my name and showing the confirmation number. She seemed a bit relieved but still uneasy. She typed a bit more on her computer, handed me a key card, and explained that some amenities might be limited because of an ongoing emergency situation. I asked her if she knew anything about a virus or outbreak, since I had seen some odd news bulletins. Her eyes flickered with worry. She confirmed that authorities were issuing warnings about a rapidly spreading infection. She didn't know all the details, but she mentioned that the local government was advising residents to stay indoors and avoid public gatherings until they could identify the cause. I thanked her and headed to my room. It was small, with a single bed, a compact bathroom, and a view of the neighboring building's rooftop. I set my suitcase down and tried Sarah again. No luck. I even attempted to message her on social media, but my phone data seemed spotty and the messages wouldn't send. It made sense to connect to the hotel's Wi-Fi, so I did that, only to discover the same alerts plastered across multiple news sites. Unidentified infection spreading. Early reports indicate unusual behavior in infected individuals. One article, roughly translated, described individuals who exhibited fever, disorientation, and a violent response to nearby people. Another piece mentioned hospitals reaching capacity in some districts. The government was asking citizens to remain calm, but there was talk about restricted travel between certain prefectures. The more I read, the more concerned I became. The word zombie was appearing in sensational news pieces, though most official sources avoided that term. They simply referred to the situation as a virus that caused erratic or aggressive actions. I tried to process this information logically. At first, I thought the word zombie was used figuratively to describe how people were acting. The idea of an actual undead outbreak seemed impossible. I came up with a plan: get in touch with Sarah, confirm she was safe, and figure out what local advice we should follow. If we had to stay in the hotel for a day or two until this issue blew over, so be it. I sent her an email, hoping she could at least get back to me whenever she found internet access. A few hours later, the day outside was turning to dusk. I looked out the window to see if the streets had become more deserted. Instead, I saw groups of people moving quickly, some heading toward the train station, others piling into private vehicles. I heard sirens in the distance, which sounded like ambulances or possibly police cars. Something told me I should stay indoors for the moment. My stomach rumbled. I realized I hadn't eaten since the airplane meal, so I decided to check the hotel restaurant. I went down to the lobby and saw the front desk staff hurriedly speaking with another guest, a tall man with a large backpack. The staff member kept repeating something about an evacuation order, but the man looked confused. He noticed me and switched to English, explaining that a notice had come in from local authorities advising an immediate citywide lockdown. Public transportation might be shutting down, and certain roads could be closed. The staff member looked at me for confirmation, hoping I might help relay information, but I was just as confused. The restaurant was operating on limited service, but I managed to get a small meal, a bowl of rice, some vegetables, and a piece of grilled fish. While eating, I overheard two other guests discussing rumors that the infection had already reached several Tokyo wards. They said local social media was calling it a zombie virus, though official announcements referred to it as a severe neurological infection. The infection apparently spread through bites or direct contact with bodily fluids. I realized I was gripping my chopsticks too hard. Although I was trying to remain calm, everything felt surreal. After dinner, I went to the front desk again and asked if the staff had any updates on travel restrictions. The lady there simply repeated the recommendation: remain indoors if possible. She glanced at the phone lines on her desk, which seemed to have sporadic reception. "We wait for more instructions," she murmured. I returned to my room, determined to keep checking my phone for any word from Sarah. Finally, around 10 p.m., I got a cryptic message from her. It read, "Stuck at small apartment near Asakusa. People acting strange. Police blocking roads. Virus real. Infected attacking anyone outside." My entire plan for a peaceful vacation shattered at that moment. I needed more details, but the message ended abruptly. I sent multiple responses, but nothing got through. Morning arrived. I noticed a shift in the energy of the entire hotel. The staff member who had checked me in was no longer at the front desk. A younger employee was there instead, looking pale and uneasy. The lobby lights were dimmed, and the large windows overlooking the street were covered with newspapers taped from the inside. The staff member told me that they had been instructed to reinforce the windows. I stepped outside for a moment, just to see what was happening on the street. The scene that greeted me was unlike anything I could have anticipated. Several cars were parked at odd angles, as if abandoned in a hurry. Some had open doors, while others had cracks in the windows. I saw a row of bicycles toppled near a vending machine. Discarded bags and clothing lay scattered on the sidewalk. A loudspeaker announcement echoed from somewhere in the distance. "This is an emergency broadcast. A virus of unknown origin has been reported. Residents are urged to stay indoors and avoid contact with infected individuals. Seek medical attention if you experience fever or confusion." My gaze swept across the area. There were people further down the block, but they moved oddly. Some were hunched over, stumbling across the pavement. Others had torn clothing and vacant expressions. They seemed oblivious to anything except the presence of others. The word zombie flashed through my mind again, this time with far more gravity. I watched as two of these individuals suddenly lunged at someone wearing a mask and carrying a bag of groceries. The attacker grabbed and bit them. There was a muffled cry, and then the victim fell to the ground. The attacker and two more infected figures surrounded that person. I felt an overwhelming urge to step back into the hotel. I allowed the door to close behind me and locked it, pressing the metal bar into place. My breathing was erratic. News articles I'd read had described the scenario calmly, but seeing it happen in front of me was entirely different. I took a moment in the empty lobby to steady myself. I needed to do something. I needed to figure out how to get home, or at least find Sarah and stay safe. The idea of leaving her to fend for herself in Asakusa felt wrong. She was my friend, and we had traveled here together, albeit on different flights. I knew Asakusa was just a few train stops away, normally an easy trip on the Ginza line or a short taxi ride. In these circumstances, everything had changed. Public transportation might be down or unsafe. The roads could be blocked by infected people. Still, the connection I had with Sarah gave me the resolve to try. I returned to my room, grabbed my backpack, and tried to think of what supplies I might need. My original plan was to explore Tokyo as a tourist, so my gear wasn't meant for an emergency. I had a small flashlight, a refillable water bottle, some snacks, and my phone charger. I tossed in a spare set of clothes and a light jacket. The question of self-defense crossed my mind, but I had nothing except maybe a small pocket knife intended for cutting open packaging or fruit. I had never considered the possibility of needing to defend myself from infected individuals in a major city. Before leaving the hotel, I checked at the front desk one last time. The younger staff member said the manager had left during the night to find relatives. Some guests had barricaded themselves in their rooms. The staff member looked at me imploringly and said, "We are told not to go out." But then they also mentioned that supplies were running low. They didn't force me to stay. I realized that if I did remain here, I might soon face shortages of food or water. The infection situation wasn't likely to resolve quickly. I thanked the staff member, wished them safety, and stepped out onto the street. The sky was overcast, casting a grey light over everything. I tightened the straps on my backpack and moved carefully down the sidewalk. Broken glass crunched underfoot. I tried not to attract attention. Ahead, I saw two infected individuals stumbling aimlessly, clothing torn at the sleeves. They paid me no attention because I was behind them, staying as quiet as possible. I reached a crosswalk near a small convenience store with its door propped open. The inside looked ransacked. Shelves were knocked over and spilled items littered the floor. I ducked in quickly, searching for anything useful. Amid the mess, I found a few bottled drinks and packaged food that hadn't been taken. I stuffed them into my backpack, grateful for any extra supplies. Then I noticed a faint rustling sound behind the counter. I froze. It was a store clerk, eyes glazed and breathing heavily. They had a noticeable bite wound on their arm. They looked at me without recognition, as if I was just an object. Then they lurched forward, nearly crashing into the counter. I realized they were in the later stages of this virus, or maybe I should call it an infection. I backed away and slipped out the door before they could shuffle around the counter. My mind reeled at how rapidly this was happening. Outside, the streets were scattered with a few infected individuals, some wandering alone, others in pairs. They didn't seem organized, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. I tried to recall the route to Asakusa. I knew it was to the east, maybe a 20 or 30-minute walk under normal conditions. Along the way, I saw more signs of sudden evacuation. A police car was parked on the sidewalk, with its lights flashing, but there was no officer inside. Stores had metal shutters down, with signs indicating emergency closures. Every block felt like a risk. Occasionally, I spotted uninfected civilians darting between buildings, doing the same thing as me, trying to stay unnoticed. Some carried backpacks or suitcases, others clutched makeshift weapons like broom handles or metal rods. At one intersection, a group of 4 people spoke urgently in Japanese. One of them noticed me and gestured for me to join them. They were worried about a cluster of infected near the next alley. I managed to communicate that I was headed to Asakusa, and one of them, a man named Kenji, said he was also planning to go that direction to check on family. We teamed up, forming a small group of 5. It felt safer than traveling alone. Kenji spoke a bit of English, so he relayed messages to me. He said the virus had spread faster than anyone expected. The rumor was that it originated from an illegal shipment of contaminated material, though no one knew for sure. The only certainty was that those who got bitten or exposed to infected fluids rapidly turned aggressive and lost all sense of awareness. As we made our way through side streets, we witnessed multiple confrontations. We saw an individual banging on a locked shop door, moaning in a low tone. We weren't sure if that person was infected or just desperate for supplies. We didn't approach to find out. We crept along the edges of buildings and tried to stay hidden whenever a group of infected was in sight. There were moments when we had to hold our breath behind cars or slip into narrow alleyways. Eventually, we reached a block near the Sumida River. Normally, the walkways along this river offer stunning views, especially during cherry blossom season, with trees lining the paths. Now they were vacant except for a few stragglers. We could see the faint outline of the Tokyo skytree in the distance, partially obscured by gloomy clouds. The water was calm, reflecting the grey sky. That sense of emptiness was disconcerting, like the city itself was holding its breath. As we approached a small bridge, Kenji mentioned that crossing might be risky, but it was our best direct route to Asakusa. We decided to proceed carefully. Partway across, we heard movement behind us. 6 or 7 infected individuals emerged from somewhere on the opposite side of the river. They moved in a staggered line, noticing us all at once. Their behavior was erratic, but there was a single-minded focus in their eyes once they locked onto living people. Our group immediately broke into a run. We dashed across the rest of the bridge, not daring to look back, though we could hear them following. Kenji signaled that we should cut through a narrow alley on the right. We could see a few vacant stalls that might be part of an outdoor market. The alley was tight enough that if we moved quickly, the infected might not follow in a large group. 3 of our group made it into the alley. I heard a yell from behind and turned to see one of the others trip on a loose pavement stone. Before we could react, 2 infected figures reached them. There was a brief struggle, and then that person disappeared from view, taken down by the attackers. Another member of our group tried to help, but Kenji pulled them away, shouting something about no time and we have to keep going. I followed, not wanting to leave anyone behind, yet also aware that staying to fight was a losing battle. The infected outnumbered us, and we had no real weapons. The 4 of us that remained sprinted deeper into the alley. We reached a set of metal doors marked as a loading entrance for a local shop. They were locked, but Kenji and another member of our group, Yuki, found a loose board nearby and managed to pry the doors open enough for us to slip inside. We quietly closed them behind us, using a broken piece of shelving to brace the door. Inside, we found ourselves in a storage area filled with boxes of merchandise. The space was dimly lit by small windows near the ceiling. We took a moment to catch our breath. Kenji said a quick prayer under his breath for the person we lost. There was a sense of quiet mourning, but we couldn't stay still for too long. We needed to keep moving if we were going to reach Asakusa and find Sarah and Kenji's family. We carefully moved through the darkened store, mindful of any infected that might already be inside. The store itself looked looted, with goods scattered everywhere. Shelves were knocked over, creating a maze of debris. We tiptoed around broken glass and tried not to make noise. A sudden crashing sound made us halt. Something fell over in the next aisle. We turned our flashlights toward the noise and saw an infected figure crawling over toppled boxes. Their clothing was torn, and their movements were awkward. They appeared to sense our presence but were stuck behind a pile of debris, reaching out with trembling arms. We backed away slowly, not wanting to attract more infected. Luckily, we found an unlocked side door that led back onto a street near Asakusa. The view outside was disturbing. Cherry blossom petals covered the sidewalks, but they were mixed with discarded belongings and signs of hurried departures. We could see the iconic Kaminari Gate in the distance, usually packed with tourists taking photos, but now the area looked deserted. Kenji told us that his apartment complex was a few blocks away. I explained that Sierra was also somewhere in this district, though I only had an address from her initial messages. We agreed to stick together until we found both Sarah and Kenji's family. We navigated the streets, calling out softly for survivors. Occasionally, we heard distant sounds of movement, sometimes infected, sometimes people hiding. We tried not to intrude on barricaded shops or private spaces, respecting the fact that many had set up their own defenses. Eventually, we turned a corner and saw a line of 3 police cars, lights still flashing, parked diagonally across an intersection. Barricades were set up, and behind them stood several uniformed officers. They noticed us and immediately raised their voices, telling us to stay back. Kenji spoke to them in Japanese, explaining we were looking for friends and family. One of the officers approached cautiously, his stance guarded. He listened to Kenji, and then shook his head. The infection was spreading too fast, and they could not allow civilians to pass. They mentioned that the local government was struggling to set up secure zones, and that this entire area might be evacuated or locked down completely. I explained in English that we needed to find a friend who was stranded nearby. The officer looked at me with genuine sympathy, but said he could not guarantee our safety if we continued. There was no official rescue operation in place at the moment. Medical services were overwhelmed, and the best advice he could give was to find a secure location and wait for further instructions. However, he did mention that the road leading north might be less crowded. He warned us to watch out for infected individuals on side streets and suggested we avoid traveling alone. I could tell that even the officers themselves seemed unsure of how to proceed. They were simply following orders and trying to contain the situation. Kenji thanked them for the information. Our group decided to keep moving north, hoping to loop around and reach Kenji's apartment from another direction. It felt risky, but turning back meant giving up any chance of finding Sarah and Kenji's family. As we walked, the city felt more and more like a labyrinth of uncertainties. The once thriving streets were silent, except for occasional noises that hinted at infected presence. A few times we had to duck behind vehicles or slip into shops to avoid being seen. All the while, I tried to message Sarah, hoping she would respond with her exact location. Finally, my phone buzzed. A new message arrived. Hiding with 2 locals. We are near Sensoji Temple. Some infected here. Doors blocked. Not sure how long we can wait. Relief and worry mingled inside me. At least she was alive, but she needed help. Sensoji Temple was a major landmark in Asakusa, normally swarming with tourists. I showed the message to Kenji, who nodded and said that the temple was only a short walk from his apartment. It made sense to continue. We pressed on, encountering more scenes of chaos. We saw sidewalks where personal items were dropped in mid-escape, including suitcases, shoes, and even passports. Vehicles were often left running, headlights illuminating empty streets. Some storefronts had been thoroughly looted, with glass doors shattered. It wasn't just infected individuals that posed a threat. There were also signs of opportunistic behavior from people looking to steal whatever they could in the absence of law enforcement. Now and then, the smell of smoke drifted through the air, suggesting fires in nearby districts. Kenji led us down a side street lined with low-rise apartment buildings. He stopped in front of a modest complex with a small courtyard, pointing to a second-story window. We could see that the window was open, but no lights were on inside. Kenji called out softly. A silhouette appeared behind the curtain. It was an older woman, Kenji's mother. She gave a subdued wave. The door to the building was locked, but she buzzed us in. We hurried upstairs and found Kenji's mother standing in the hallway, clearly relieved to see her son. She explained, in rapid Japanese, that most neighbors had either fled or locked themselves in. The power was still on, but water pressure was low. She hadn't ventured outside since she heard about the virus spreading in nearby districts. Kenji embraced his mother briefly, then introduced me and the others. She welcomed us in, offering limited hospitality in the form of bottled water and a place to rest. I asked if I could use her balcony to see if Sensoji Temple was visible from that vantage point. She nodded. On the balcony, I looked out at the neighborhood. From this elevated spot, I could see the top of the temple's pagoda. Smoke rose in thin trails from various points around the area. The cityscape was a mix of neon signs still flickering, darkened windows, and emptiness. Occasionally, a faint scream echoed. The temple area itself appeared mostly dark, with only emergency lights glowing. Sarah was somewhere in that vicinity, waiting for help. I showed Kenji the temple spire, pointing out the direction. He suggested we rest for a moment, gather our thoughts, and then decide how to proceed. For the first time in hours, we had a moment of relative safety. The apartment was small but felt secure, with solid locks on the doors and windows. Kenji's mother insisted we take some food, mostly rice crackers and canned soup. We ate in silence, each of us reflecting on the day's events. After a short while, I stood up. I told Kenji I couldn't wait much longer. Sarah's last message sounded urgent. Kenji agreed, saying his mother would stay here barricaded. She had enough supplies to last a few days, and there was no sense in moving her from a relatively safe spot. Kenji's mother was concerned, but she also understood that her son felt a responsibility to help. She gave him a small talisman and whispered words of encouragement. Yuki, the other member of our group, decided to stay with Kenji's mother. That left just Kenji and me to attempt the short trip to the temple. We said our farewells, then headed out. The sky was starting to darken again, a sign that another night was upon us. This time, we knew we had to move fast, because once darkness fell, visibility would be worse, and the infected could be anywhere. The streets near the temple were in disarray. Some overhead lanterns were smashed, and debris littered the ground. The entrance gate leading to Sensoji Temple, usually brightly lit and buzzing with activity, was deserted. We moved carefully along the main pathway that led to the temple's courtyard. Shops on either side were closed, their shutters forming a metal corridor. The scene felt entirely foreign compared to the tourist destination I had seen in pictures. Near the main temple building, we saw a few infected individuals wandering around. Their movements were slow, yet unpredictable. Kenji motioned for me to stay low. We ducked behind a large stone lantern. In the distance, I noticed some figures standing near a side door of the temple hall. I wasn't sure if they were infected or normal survivors. We crept closer, using shadows to hide. When we were about 20 feet away, I recognized Sarah's hairstyle. She was with two other people, one man and one woman, both dressed casually. They stood near a barricaded door. Sarah looked tense but focused. I waved in a subtle motion. She saw me and signaled for me to approach quietly. Kenji and I made our way over, keeping an eye on the infected who roamed the courtyard. Sarah exhaled with relief when she saw me up close. She explained that the side door led to a storage room within the temple complex. She and her companions had taken shelter there, but a group of infected had forced them out into the courtyard. They'd managed to barricade the door from the outside, trapping the infected inside that particular hallway. We didn't have time for a long reunion. We had to figure out a safer spot. This courtyard was too exposed. One of Sarah's new companions, a local named Haru, mentioned a rumor that some city officials were trying to secure a hospital or school building to serve as a shelter. They had heard radio chatter indicating there might be safe zones forming in certain wards. With so many roads blocked, it was unclear if that was a viable option. Still, we needed some plan beyond hiding in half-collapsed rooms. Haru suggested we exit the temple grounds and try to reach the next neighborhood over, which apparently had fewer reported cases. We all agreed it was worth a try. We began maneuvering around the temple, sticking to the edges of the courtyard. One infected individual turned toward us, so we froze. The infected person staggered in our direction, arms raised slightly. We stayed silent behind a column, and after a long pause, they drifted away. We took a small gate out of the temple complex and found ourselves on a narrow residential street. The sky had grown darker, and only a few streetlights were working. In the distance, a siren wailed, then cut off abruptly. No one else was around, which was both a relief and a worry. We moved in single file, trying to make as little noise as possible. A few blocks down, we saw a cluster of uninfected civilians. They waved us over. Kenji and Haru went first to speak with them, ensuring they weren't hostile. They turned out to be a group of neighbors who had gathered what supplies they could and were planning to move together to a rumored safe zone near a community center. They had heard that the local ward office was distributing information on how to evacuate. The group was cautious about taking in strangers, but after a brief conversation and seeing we carried minimal supplies, they agreed to let us join them. There was safety in numbers, so our larger group, now about 10 people, set off towards the community center. We took side streets to avoid any main roads that might be filled with infected or abandoned vehicles. Occasionally we heard distant sounds of conflict, shouts, breaking glass, or screams that cut through the night air. Our group tried to remain calm and focused. Some carried flashlights, others carried sticks or metal poles for protection. We approached the community center to find it locked and dark. A notice on the door indicated that operations had ceased due to the outbreak. The group's morale dipped. We had walked all that way hoping for official guidance, but none was available. Some members of the group expressed frustration or fear. Kenji tried to reassure them, suggesting we could check the ward office or even City Hall. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. We both knew we couldn't continue wandering the streets indefinitely. One of the neighbors said she had a friend who worked at a local school. Sometimes, schools are converted into emergency shelters during disasters. There was a chance the building might be open, or at least suitable for defense. It was about a 20-minute walk north. At that point, the group was tired, but we agreed that having any kind of secure shelter was better than standing in front of a locked community center. We resumed our journey. By now the city was enveloped in darkness, with occasional flickers from damaged streetlights. Flashlight beams swept across alleyways. Fallen cherry blossoms created a strange contrast on the roads, their gentle pink color overshadowed by the crisis unfolding. The air carried a slight chill, reminding me that it was still early spring. As we moved further from Asakusa, the roads grew quieter, but we still encountered infected individuals now and then. They stumbled in random directions or lingered near crashed vehicles. Our group took great care to avoid them. We communicated with whispers and hand signals. At one point, we had to cross a wider intersection. 2 infected figures spotted us and advanced quickly. We had no choice but to run. The entire group sprinted across the intersection, with the infected in pursuit. One of the neighbors, a man in his 60s, tripped on a piece of debris. He fell onto the pavement with a heavy thud. Several people rushed back to help him up, but one of the infected was almost upon us. Kenji reacted by swinging a metal pole he had found. The infected figure was knocked off balance. Sarah and I helped pull the older man to his feet and we scrambled away. The infected regained footing and lunged again, but we managed to slip around a corner, losing them in the maze of side streets. Breathing heavily, The group ducked behind a parked delivery truck, listening for any sign that the infected had followed. After a tense moment, we heard nothing. We continued on, supporting the older man who had twisted his ankle. Finally, we turned onto a street where the school building loomed ahead of us, a tall, rectangular structure with large windows. We approached the front gate cautiously. The metal gate was partially open, and the courtyard was dark. One of the group members shined a flashlight through the bars. The building itself looked intact, and we saw no immediate movement. We debated how best to enter. Then a voice called from the second-floor window, "Who's there?" It was a young woman in what looked like a teacher's uniform. She sounded alarmed. We called back, explaining that we were survivors seeking shelter. After a brief pause, she ran down to open the main entrance for us. She introduced herself as Miss Tanaka. She and a few co-workers had been using the building as a makeshift refuge for about 10 people, mostly faculty, and a few parents who got stranded when the outbreak began. They had secured the entrances and moved essential supplies into the gym. The school still had running water and some generator power. It was as close to a safe zone as we'd seen all day. Miss Tanaka was cautious but kind. She asked if anyone in our group had been bitten or showed symptoms of the virus. Everyone denied any infection. She led us inside, where we found a barricaded lobby. Tables and chairs were stacked against the doors, and windows were reinforced with boards. Her small group of survivors watched us with wary faces, but they softened once they realized we had no infected among us. That night, we finally had a moment to rest, without constant fear of infected attacking. The group arranged sleeping spots in classrooms and the gym. We inventoried our supplies, canned goods, bottled water, first aid kits, and a few flashlights. Miss Tanaka informed us that they were rationing everything. She also said they had an old radio that occasionally picked up government broadcasts. According to the most recent announcement, evacuation points were being set up in certain wards, but it was unclear how to reach them with so many roads blocked. Sarah and I spoke quietly about our next steps. We both had families back in the United States who would worry if they couldn't reach us. Kenji expressed concern about his mother, though at least she was safe for the time being. Other survivors were in the same predicament, uncertain about relatives or friends scattered across the city. None of us knew how long this situation would last. Throughout the night, we took turns standing guard in the hallway, listening for any sounds of infected. The building remained silent except for the gentle hum of emergency lights and the distant rumble of sirens. By morning, some of us were exhausted, but at least we had avoided any direct attacks. In the daylight, Miss Tanaka checked the radio again. The broadcast repeated warnings about an unknown virus causing aggressive behavior and urged citizens to seek official shelters if possible. The announcers said rescue efforts were underway, but the scale of the outbreak had overwhelmed the system. Certain roads and train lines were closed indefinitely. The virus was being called an unprecedented crisis. Some unverified reports referred to it as a zombie infection, which only added to the panic. We spent most of the day reinforcing the school's doors and windows. Sarah and I helped gather anything that could be repurposed into tools or barricades, such as mop handles, broomsticks, or metal rods from storage areas. Kenji coordinated with the neighbors we had arrived with, setting up a rotating watch schedule. Every so often, we heard faint moaning sounds from the streets. The infected were wandering around, sometimes approaching the gates, but then losing interest when they didn't see movement. It was an odd sort of siege. We stayed out of sight, hoping they would pass by without focusing on the building. Days passed in this manner. We subsisted on rationed food and conserved water. Communication with the outside world was sporadic at best. My phone battery stayed alive, thanks to the generator, but cell service remained unreliable. Sarah and I took turns trying to contact home, but the calls never went through. Local lines were overwhelmed or down. We managed to share messages of reassurance with each other, but there was no telling if our families back home had any updates. The city's condition didn't improve. From the second-floor windows, we sometimes saw columns of smoke rising in the distance. We overheard distant gunshots once or twice, but we didn't know if they came from law enforcement or frightened civilians. Miss Tanaka's group accepted us as part of their community, and we worked together to maintain some sense of order. One afternoon, Miss Tanaka got a clearer radio transmission. It mentioned that a major evacuation was taking place in western Tokyo. The self-defense forces were establishing a secure perimeter and planning to escort survivors out of the hardest-hit wards. We quickly tried to confirm the location and timing of this evacuation. The broadcast suggested that relief convoys might pass near our area within the next 2 days, but nothing was guaranteed. We held a group meeting in the gym. Some wanted to attempt to reach the evacuation route, believing it was the best chance of escaping the outbreak. Others argued that leaving the school was too dangerous, because traveling through infected zones could lead to disaster. Sarah and I were torn. We wanted to believe that an official evacuation could help us get back home. Kenji was concerned about his mother, but traveling back to her apartment might be even riskier than heading for the convoy. Eventually, we settled on a plan. Half of the group would try to reach the convoy, while the other half would remain in the school. Kenji and I decided to go with the evacuation group, along with Sarah and a few others, while Miss Tanaka and some staff members would remain behind with those who were unwilling or unable to travel. Kenji hoped that, if we found the convoy, he could convince them to stop by his mother's building, or at least direct a rescue team there. It was a long shot, but better than doing nothing. That night we said farewells to those staying behind. We shared extra supplies, making sure each group had a reasonable chance of surviving. At dawn, we would set out, hoping to navigate the streets carefully. A man named Hiroshi took the lead, armed with a detailed map of the city. He had worked as a delivery driver and knew the area better than anyone else in our group. Dawn arrived quietly. We gathered by the school entrance, ensuring the barricades inside remained intact for those staying behind. Miss Tanaka gave us a solemn nod, and we slipped out into the pale morning light. The roads were still lined with abandoned cars and scattered debris. A few infected roamed in the distance. We moved in a tight formation, scanning for threats. Our plan was to follow side streets and alleyways, eventually reaching a major road that the radio indicated might be on the convoy's route. The journey was tense. Every step felt like it carried a risk of running into a group of infected. We passed through neighborhoods that showed signs of recent chaos. Damaged storefronts, smashed windows, occasional signs of small fires. At one point, we rounded a corner and came face to face with 3 infected individuals. Their bodies were rigid with tension, and they immediately lunged when they saw us. Hiroshi raised a metal pipe in defense, while Kenji tried to usher us back. The infected moved faster than expected, closing the distance rapidly. Hiroshi managed to strike one, causing it to stumble. Another infected figure grabbed one of the neighbors, pulling them down. We could only watch as the neighbor attempted to push the attacker away, but the infected pinned them with overwhelming strength. In the chaos, Sarah and I retreated behind a nearby car. Kenji tried to pull the infected off the neighbor, but was nearly grabbed himself. Hiroshi struck the infected again, and Kenji managed to free the neighbor who had been bitten in the struggle. We pulled the neighbor away, but they were in shock, cradling a deep bite wound. Hiroshi yelled for us to keep moving, and we scrambled away from the scene as more infected emerged. We knew the neighbor's wound was a serious problem. The virus was said to spread through bites. Once symptoms set in, it was only a matter of time before they lost awareness and became aggressive. The neighbor, whose name was Akira, looked terrified. They pleaded with us not to leave them behind, but also recognized the likelihood of infection. We tried to clean the wound with what little first aid we had, but no one had the expertise to handle something this severe. Our group pressed onward, hoping to at least find the convoy's route before Akira's condition worsened. Every few blocks, we had to pause and check for infected. Akira started feeling feverish, sweating profusely. They insisted they could keep going, but we could see the strain in their eyes. About 2 hours into our journey, we stopped in an empty parking garage to rest and reassess. Akira slumped against a concrete pillar, breathing heavily. They looked at us with a resigned expression, quietly asking us to continue without them before they became a threat. Kenji argued that we might still save Akira if we found medical personnel, but we had no idea where to find that help. Akira slowly stood and walked a few steps away from us, leaning against a wall. They thanked us for trying and said they understood if we had to go on. No one in the group wanted to abandon Akira, but the reality was grim. Some of our group members exchanged anguished glances, uncertain of how to proceed. In the end, Akira made the decision for us, urging us to leave. We gathered a few supplies for Akira, leaving them water and a flashlight. It felt hollow and wrong, but we had no better options. We said our farewells, then moved on, haunted by the knowledge of what would likely happen. We pressed forward, grimly determined to reach that major road. Around midday, we heard the faint hum of engines. We followed the sound until we reached an overpass that overlooked a wide thoroughfare. Below, we saw a convoy of military trucks. It appeared they were on the move, heading west. Our group rushed to the side of the overpass, waving our arms and shouting for attention. The trucks began to slow. Soldiers wearing protective gear climbed down. One of them spoke through a megaphone, instructing us to remain where we were until they could verify we were not infected. We descended a ramp that led to the thoroughfare, keeping our hands visible. The soldiers approached, scanning us for signs of bites or illness. Kenji explained in Japanese that we had traveled from Asakusa. Some of us were foreigners, and we needed help. The soldier listened carefully, then radioed someone. After a few tense minutes, they escorted us to a transport truck at the back of the convoy. They said they were evacuating people to a secure facility outside the city. Everyone had to undergo medical checks upon arrival. Hiroshi asked if the convoy could stop by the apartment building where Kenji's mother was waiting, but the soldier seemed reluctant. The route was already set, and diverging too far might compromise the mission. However, they mentioned that once we reached the secure facility, we could file a request for a rescue operation if resources allowed. It was not the guarantee Kenji wanted, but it was the best he could get. They told us to quickly board the truck. We climbed inside, relieved to find about a dozen other survivors already seated. Some wore blankets, others clutched backpacks or bags. I recognized the look in their eyes: exhaustion, uncertainty, and a small spark of hope that maybe we would be safer now. Sarah settled in next to me, and Kenji found a spot near the back, still looking worried about his mother. The truck's engine rumbled. We began moving in a tight formation with the other vehicles. Through the small window at the back, I saw the abandoned cityscape rolling by. Occasionally the convoy halted when they encountered debris or infected along the road, but soldiers would clear the path efficiently. This was a glimpse of some semblance of order amidst the chaos. As we rolled on, I realized I didn't know where exactly this facility was, or what conditions we would find there. I only knew that we were leaving the heart of the outbreak behind. I thought about everything that had happened: the quiet arrival in Tokyo, the strange tension at the airport, the deserted streets, the desperate search for Sarah, the horrifying encounters with infected, the temporary refuge in the school, and the journey to find this convoy. It felt like years had passed, though it had only been a few days. Sarah and I exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of how drastically our dream trip had changed. Neither of us knew what the future held. We had only a faint glimmer of optimism that somewhere, beyond the current crisis, life might return to something resembling normal. Until then, we were just survivors, hoping that this evacuation would lead to safety, medical help, and maybe a chance to contact our families. As the convoy continued along the highway, the pink blossoms of the season occasionally drifted across the road, carried by the wind. Even in this grim scenario, they reminded me of the beauty that had drawn me to Japan in the first place. I couldn't forget the images of those blossoms floating across blood-stained sidewalks back in Ueno Park. The contrast between natural splendor and the tragedy unfolding around us was striking. We traveled onward, leaving behind the hushed streets and empty train stations. The city skyline gradually faded into the distance. No one knew if the infection could be contained or if it would spread beyond these borders. For the moment, though, we were moving in the right direction, guided by the determined soldiers who believed they could establish a safe zone. And so, my journey to witness the legendary cherry blossoms ended in a way I never could have imagined. Fleeing a virus that turned ordinary people into something unrecognizable, navigating a city consumed by fear, and relying on the slim chance that an evacuation could offer a lifeline. I still hold on to a small hope that one day I might return to a Tokyo restored to its vibrant, bustling self. Until then, all I can do is share this account, so that others might understand what truly happened under those flowering trees when the infection took hold. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.